So hopefully you can see my slides. First of all, I thought though we'd try Menti if this works. I'm always a bit nervous about doing this sort of thing especially when you can't see people's faces when you're not in the room necessarily. But I'm guessing most of you used Menti before. So if you go to menti.com and use that code, or I will post hopefully the direct link in the chat, and just tell me what you understand by open science, just as a bit of a sort of icebreaker. I'll try and I'm getting myself confused now. Where's my chat? Let's try again. I can't figure out if somebody else can maybe put the link in if they hasn't or not. Sorry, but hopefully you should be able to use the code and Menti to just tell me what you understand by open science. Thanks, Sophia. So you need that code 335026-8. You can do it on a phone or just another tab. This is where I get nervous in case is anybody there? Everything open access. Yeah, open access is something we'll come back to. You can play as well, Ica, if you're there. I will mention Ica's work. I think I might struggle to get through everything we want to talk about, but I'm meant to touch base with you, Ica. In any case, I think you'll probably cover some of the similar ground that we might touch on as well. Making the results of scientific research available without paywalls. Again, refers to open access, perhaps more than open science per se. Accessible, reusable, and reproducible. Yeah, so reproducibility is a really good term that we'll come back to, and that's I think what Ica again we'll be talking about in more detail. Making science material code, and results available for everyone, open access. So yeah, I suppose I'm just trying to unpick. I mean, we'll be talking about open access in some detail, but I also want to unpick the sort of broader range of open science and how this relates to the EU's position on open science. Research in which data and results are freely available for the research community. Yep, that's great, thank you. So the next question, which hopefully should come up, I'm never quite sure. Sorry, I've got a dog under my feet as well. It's fun working from home. Good, clear. I understand manuscripts and research can be accessed in anyone without need for journal subscriptions or affiliation. Yes. So now, quickly before I start the presentation, I just want to ask. How familiar you are with these terms and concepts. Again, this is really useful for us in the library because inevitably, as we all tend to do, we do use a bit of jargon in our respective areas. So these are some of the terms we'll be talking about. So if you, again, indicate on the same place, it should have changed for you with the same code if you didn't manage before. So menti.com with 335026-8. And thanks, Anna, for that. Put the code in. I'm not that used to driving Zoom, you see. That's another confusing thing. Teams I can just about manage now, but Zoom, I wasn't sure how to use the chat at the same time as presenting. Okay, this is interesting. So you can see there's quite a few people contributing, and we're still hovering around halfway or less for many of these concepts and terms, but reproducibility being the highest. Pre-registration very low, and harking. And again, I may not have time, I'm conscious of time already, but to talk about that in detail, but I'm guessing perhaps Ica might touch on that. Sorry to talk to you off camera, as it were, Ica, but I know you'll be touching on some of these. And harking, again, that's something else that people don't seem to have heard of. Okay, given time, I'll just move on quickly, but that is really useful. Thank you. How do I stop sharing that? I go back to my slides. So what we'll try and cover today, and as I say, I know we've got a limited time and another couple of speakers, but we'll talk a little bit about open research at Leeds as opposed to open science. I'll sort of explain why we tend to use the term open research rather than open science, but it means the same thing effectively. Then talk about the EU and open science, their particular requirements. They have mandatory and recommended open science practices, so we'll talk about their mandatory practices. Then I'll hand over to Jonathan to talk in a bit more detail about open access. As I say, just trying to get over the sense that, you know, there is open science distinct from open access, but they are obviously related, and the open access stuff does come up in the mandatory stuff for the EU as well. Talk a bit about the EU funding stream. So in particular, we were asked to touch on H2020, Horizon 2020, which is the old one, and Horizon Europe, which is the newer one. The rules changed in January 2021. And again, then Jonathan will talk about how that relates to the different rules for open access. Transitional agreements, that's a big aspect of that as well. And again, Jonathan will talk about that. If I've got time, I will talk about some of the specifics of open science that we sort of touched on there. So things like open and fair data, open licensing, software and code. The EU open research platform is a really interesting thing if you haven't seen that already. Reproducibility, pre-registration, and how that relates to questionable research practices. May not have enough time to go into that in detail, but as I say, sorry, Iko again, but I did mean to catch up with you before this talk, and I'm pretty sure you'll touch on some of that when you talk. So, in terms of open science, we're really sort of saying, you know, open access is not enough, and this is a definition around open science, you know, relating to reproducible science, research and scholarship across the wide range of disciplines, which is why we tend to use the term open research. I think in many European languages, science tends to encompass the humanities, for example, in a way that the term doesn't in English. So we tend to use at least the term research rather than open research rather than open science. As you see here, it sort of emphasizes the fact that it's open and cooperative, such that material can be throughout the research life cycle be shared early and as widely as early and widely as possible. It includes early and open sharing of research through things like pre-registration, as I say. If I don't get onto that, I'm pretty sure I will touch on it. Registered reports, preprints, again, very interested in people's opinions and practice and experiences of preprints in different disciplines, because it does differ in different disciplines. And crowdsourcing. We've actually got an event tomorrow. If anybody's interested, I'll post a link later when I've stopped sharing my own slides around citizen science. So that's an area that the EU also mentioned in the context of open science. Then research output management. Again, we talk about outputs perhaps more than data, because increasingly data tends to be synonymous, you know, with spreadsheets and sort of STEM disciplines, and we're trying to be as broad as possible in terms of the wide range of outputs that can be associated with all manner of research, and all how that relates to reproducibility, such that research results can be reproduced, as well as open access to the research outputs, not only the publications, but the data, software, models, algorithms, workflows, you know, absolutely anything and everything throughout the research process. Also things like participating in open peer review and involving all relevant knowledge actors. So as I say, including citizens, and I will highlight that event we've got tomorrow on citizen science with a colleague from the Faculty of Biological Sciences. So that's from the Horizon Europe programme guide. And there's a illustration over there on the right hand side in terms of some of the skills areas. So this is a huge challenge for us in library land at the moment. I think, you know, trying to make sure that we're equipped to support colleagues, academic colleagues in all these areas, but also for you as academics, as well as trying to get to grips with all these different areas and, you know, newer skills that perhaps there's not, you know, that you may not be that familiar with. A quick word on research culture, open research here at Leeds, which is part of the research culture work that is being led by Dr. Kat Davies as the Dean for Research Culture. This is now a crucial aspect of you know, work at the university. It encompasses things like reproducible research, but also responsible metrics. And again, I don't think we'll have too much time to go into that in detail, but this is about changing what we value in research. So historically, research has been measured by sort of proxy measures, things like journal impact factor. You know, if you get a high a publication in a so-called high impact journal like Nature, which is also very expensive, which we can come on to. That can be seen as a proxy for research quality, which is what we as a sector and as a university are trying to get away from, and that cuts across a range of research funders, including the EU, are all committed to the Declaration of Open Research Assessment, is what DORA stands for. The 5 components of open research at Leeds, as I say, synonymous really with open science or open access, open data, open platforms, tools and services, an open approach to conducting research, and transparency and public engagement. And there is actually an open research advisory group, which is, I think, on our 4th meeting now. So this is looking at some of these issues in the round across the whole university. And there's a useful article from Kat Davies and Nick Plant linked over there on the right-hand side. Again, I'll dig out the link and post that when I've got a chance in a moment. So in terms of the EU's ambitions for open science, they talk about open data. There's things like the European Science Cloud, new generation metrics. So this relates to DORA as well. Again, there you can see in terms of things like alt metrics and not just using general impact factor. They do emphasize that, you know, there's a mutual learning exercise in open science, and that applies to us in the library as well, you know, and colleagues in the Open Research Advisory Group. You know, we're really trying to understand how open practice varies across different disciplines. They've got ambitions towards the future of scholarly communication and how that is rewarded. So again, this isn't a huge issue in terms of, you know, why should you engage with this sort of practice if it's not properly rewarded, you know, other than getting your articles in a high impact journal like Nature and all the, you know, the limitations that that has. Research integrity and reproducibility. We've already touched on citizen science. So these are the mandatory open science practices as specified in the Horizon Europe guidance. So open access to publications under the conditions required by the grant agreement. So Jonathan's going to go into more detail on that in a moment. Responsible management of research data in line with the FAIR principles of findability, accessibility, and interoperability and reusability. So that's the acronym that people didn't necessarily seem that familiar with at the outset. So this is around making sure that you're planning your data management throughout the research life cycle. We have a research data team in the library that I'm also part of, and we can help you with data management planning and to the principles of as open as possible, as closed as necessary, which is actually comes from the EU. Quite a nice way of putting it. You know, if you've got reasons you can't share data openly for ethical reasons, perhaps issues of consent from participants and that kind of thing, you may not be able to share it openly, but you may be able to share it under controlled means, subject to user consent and all that kind of stuff we can advise on. They also then stipulate that you need information about the research outputs, tools and instruments needed to validate the conclusions of scientific publications and to validate and reuse research data. Digital physical access to the results needed to validate the conclusions of scientific publications, unless exceptions apply. And they also stipulate there that in cases of public emergency, which was exemplified by the coronavirus pandemic, immediate open access to research results, and that covers things like preprints as well, which again we can touch on in a bit more detail, but that's an aspect of open access. So I'll hand over to Jonathan now. Sorry if I'm rushing a little bit, but I'm conscious of the time, and I was being attacked by a dog then, so I'm sorry about that. So I'll hand over to you, Jonathan.
Lovely, thanks, Nick. And yeah, I've got my video on now, so as you can see who's talking, which I think is always nice. So yeah, I'm going to do a quick bit of jargon busting, just around open access and the practice of making publications open access, before we get into some practical information and requirements on open access for Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe. So we'll start with gold open access, which is a term that I think most people will have come across, and probably, and almost rightly so, have probably got a sort of image of dollar signs or pound signs at least associated with it, as in a lot of cases it does involve payment of an article processing charge to a publisher. But it's not always the case. There are some alternative funding models, such as the Open Library of the Humanities, that's it's a library consortium funded venture that essentially makes articles gold open access, publishes everything open access, and there's no cost to the authors. We do have some funding for gold open access within the university. It's what I spend most of my day job doing is administering the block grants that we get from UKRI Welcome, the British Heart Foundation and Cancer Research UK. And whether you're going gold or green, there is a standing university requirement to make sure that articles are added to the university's publications database. Now, green open access is more sustainable route to open access. It involves publishing in a subscription journal. There's nothing paid to the publisher. They retain copyright, and then after a elapsed amount of time, which is usually referred to as an embargo period, then we can add the accepted manuscript to the university's institutional repository. And it's accessible that way rather from the publisher's website. Slightly less pertinent to funder compliance purposes is preprints. But it's something that is good to be aware of and engaged with. There's a few examples there: Archive, BioArchive, and then SciArchive, which is psychological sciences preprint server. It doesn't necessarily preclude later formal publication, and it's a useful tool for disseminating null results, but that's something that I think, time allowing, Nick might touch on in a little bit. There's a quick link at the bottom there to Plan S and rights retention. This might be the first time that you're hearing of Plan S. It's, in a nutshell, it's a consortium of global research funders that includes the European Commission, also the Wellcome Trust, UK Research and Innovation, and it's just a plan essentially to advance the open access agenda. And yeah, sort of supporting open research and open science, but there's a link there that goes into all the details and requirements of that. And there's also a link to an unpaywall browser extension. So if ever you do come across something that's not open access, use that browser extension and we'll have a look and see if it can be found in a institutional repository or somewhere else to get your hands on it without having to pay for it. Yeah, can you go to the next slide, please, Nick? Thank you. Okay, so yeah, onto the EU funding streams. We're in a slightly complicated situation. It would be nice to have one set of rules across all the funding streams, but sadly it's not the case. And as Nick mentioned, from the 1st of January last year, Horizon Europe introduced some new open access requirements. Under Horizon 2020, the old rules that, as we're calling them, still apply, which allows both for gold and green open access. And there's details of the embargo periods there. So if you're publishing research in the life sciences and physical sciences and engineering areas, that allows for a maximum 6-month embargo. And in social sciences and the humanities, that allows for a 12-month embargo. Under Horizon Europe, there is still the option for gold and green publishing, but the crucial thing is that those embargo periods are no longer permitted. There's a few ways around that I'll come on to, specifically transitional agreements and what's called a right retention strategy, which enables authors to submit to the journal of their choice, but retain the necessary rights to comply with their funders' open access requirements. Next slide, please, Nick. Thanks. So under Horizon 2020, there's 2 key steps for open access to publications. The first is choosing which route you're going to go down, either the green or gold open access route. And irrespective of the route that you choose, the crucial thing is that publication must always be deposited in an open access repository. So whether that's the published version because you've gone down the gold route and paid for immediate open access to it, or whether it's the accepted manuscript because you've gone down the green route, it must be in a repository regardless of which way you're complying with the requirements there. Now, the open access requirements cover all peer-reviewed publications, not conference proceedings or book chapters that stem from your MSCA project. There's the embargo periods that I mentioned previously. And the good news is that if you do opt for the gold open access route, then the article processing charges that you would pay to the publisher are eligible for reimbursement during the duration of the project, and they can be recharged to your research grant. Next slide. Now, I think it's only logical that you're probably sat there thinking, well, how do I know if a journal meets Horizon 2020's open access requirements? And the good news is that there is a way to find out. There is something that is called Sherpa Romeo, It's a database that's supported by JISC, and I think it used to be based out of the University of Nottingham. And essentially, it's just an online resource that aggregates publisher open access policies and allows you to type in a journal title, and it will spit back out a result that looks something like this that's on the screen at the moment, which shows the publisher policy, what you can do with a published version, what you can do with the accepted version. And the key thing to look at when you're looking at the embargo period requirements is the little sand hourglass next to the accepted version. And that little 12 months that you can see there, that indicates what the publisher's policy is for making the accepted version open access. So anything in there that's 6 months and under is perfectly compliant with Horizon 2020 requirements. If you're looking at 12 months plus, then that would only be an option if you're publishing in social sciences and the humanities. But if you're not, if you're in the physical sciences, then it's in those instances that you'll be looking at paying for the gold route to open access. Next slide, please, Nick. Okay, under Horizon Europe, there have been a raft of changes. And as I mentioned previously, the biggest one is that embargo periods are no longer permitted. So at the time of publication, a machine-readable electronic copy of the published version or the final peer-reviewed manuscript has to be made open access through a repository, and it's got to be immediately available with a Creative Commons attribution license. Now, Creative Commons are a not-for-profit organization that's developed a whole suite of licenses, and the attribution or CC BY license is the most open of those licenses that encourages maximum dissemination and reuse. However, there are some exceptions in the case of monographs and long text formats. There is the option there to exclude the commercial use requirement. So the CC BY NC is a non-commercial clause, and an ND is a non-derivative clause that allow you to retain a bit more control over those elements of the publication. Coming on to rights retention, there is a requirement for authors to retain sufficient intellectual property rights to comply with these open access requirements. So if you're looking at publishing in a journal that perhaps it's not a fully gold open access journal, it's what's referred to as a hybrid open access journal, then rights retention and using the statement at the bottom of the screen there that notes that the author has applied a CC BY license to the accepted manuscript arising, that's necessary in those cases. And that's because of the fourth clause in there that means that the European Commission will now only reimburse publication fees in full open access venues. So a lot of the traditional publication options, as Nick mentioned, journals like Nature, they are what is referred to as hybrid or subscription titles, and that they retain a subscription business model, but also charge for open access publishing. And that's what the collective efforts of Plan S and Horizon Europe and UKRI's new open access policy are trying to crack down on. So they've made a stand in that now it's only fully open access journals that you can use grant funds to support the open access costs for now. Next slide, please, Nick. I'm conscious that I've nearly eaten up all that time, so I'll whiz through this last one on TAs and get it back to you. So yeah, thinking about the hybrid journals that you're probably looking at and thinking, well, hang on a second, that's a really key journal in my field. I really want to submit there, but I wouldn't be able to claim the costs back. Rights retention perhaps isn't an option, or they're making life difficult. Then we have a number of what are called transitional agreements, which are agreements whose whole purpose is to try and move the business model that underlies journal publishing from subscription access to one in which publishers are essentially paid a fair price for open access publishing services. So this has stemmed from a concerted effort by institutions and libraries like ourselves, entering into deals with publishers and saying, look, we understand that we're paying you X amount of money at the moment, but I think there was a study done by the Max Planck Foundation that found that there's certainly enough money in the publishing industry for everything to be published open access and to be accessible globally, rather than individual institutions and libraries paying for subscription access. So it's kind of just a transition towards that and trying to make everything available to everyone. The crucial thing is that the University of Leeds affiliated author has to be the corresponding author to access these agreements. And there's a few publishers there that we've got the existing deals with, and there's a full list along with eligibility requirements at the link below. Next slide, please, Nick. Yeah, last but not least is for Horizon 2020, what Sherpa Romeo did. Under Horizon Europe, we now have something that's called the Journal Checker tool, which is a lot more advanced. It allows you to put in the journal, your funder, and your institution. And what this has built into it is all the transitional agreements that I just mentioned. So this database knows where we've got agreements with publishers. So what it will do is just spit out a result for you that tells you whether or not we've got an agreement in place with that journal, and then what your publishing options are in compliance with your funder's open access requirements. Right, and I think that's everything from me, so I'll pass back to Nick. Sorry, Nick, I know that I've not left you much time for everything else open science related.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do apologise about the dog as well, by the way. He's been asleep all day, and then as soon as I was talking, he came and sort of mauled me, and now he's gone again. So he's a Labrador, still a puppy. I think you swear he knew I was busy, so sorry about that. Somebody did just ask a quick question about Open Research Europe, so I'll just mention that and how it really relates to some of this stuff on the costs of open access. So we won't make you guess that at the moment, but that's how much it costs to publish a journal in Nature at the moment, which is obviously hugely expensive. And this is related to the perceived kudos of things like Nature, and that's not necessarily conducive to the pursuit of science, etc. So this is where the Declaration of Research Assessment comes in terms of not using journal-based metrics such as GIF and trying to focus on the outputs. And preprints is part of that as well. So the Open Research Platform provides fast publication, open peer review for EU-funded research. So you can just use it if you're EU-funded. It was formally launched on March 2021, and it's, as I say, open peer review. It also includes data, I should say data, not date, software. So it's not just for publication. So one of the reasons the EU have come up with this platform is partly to combat this, perceived kudos of things like Nature, etc., and the huge cost of open access. So that's relatively cheap. I mean, it's free to you, but they do obviously pay a cost to run the thing. But it's a publication way that is free of some of the burdens of traditional scholarly publishing. Given time, though, I will just pause there and see if there are any other questions. I know Ika's here, so sorry, Ika, for making a few assumptions about what you might talk about, but I'm guessing you might touch on some of the things that I would have otherwise spoken about in terms of pre-registration. These are some of the things recommended by the EU, so registry reports, open peer review, etc. So I'll stop there because I'm aware we're at time. So sorry that was a bit over time, but I'll pause there and hand on to the next speaker.